Evening, everyone. Welcome to Open Forum. I'm Dr. Hunter, and this is Open Forum. I usually like to start by asking for a show of hands who's never been to Open Forum. Okay, awesome, welcome. This is an event that happens the first Wednesday of every month with a couple of exceptions throughout the year. So from 6:30 to 8, I get together with you and discuss all topics related to health. We record the conversation, so it does appear on our website a week or two after this talk, Coeur d'Alene Healing Arts or cdahealingarts.com. So if you want to review it or share it with someone, then it'll be right there. So as I mentioned, I call this a conversation because I want it to be really dynamic. I don't have a PowerPoint behind me or anything like that. So I want you to raise your hand, ask questions. Let's take the topic where you want to learn more. So just kind of giving you that caveat. And I do, at every open forum, save time at the end of the conversation to address any and all health questions. So in a minute, I'm going to ask for people to just share what they'd like to learn more about, if that's a personally related question or otherwise, and I'll jot it on the board so we don't forget it and circle back around to it. Of course, I've come prepared to talk about a topic, so that piece will be included in what we talk about if your question relates to kind of gut-brain health, so to speak. So I also want to share just a little sign-in sheet. It's not really a sign-in sheet, it's just more if you want to learn about the things Coeur d'Alene Healing Arts does, lectures, detoxes, events. We send stuff out to our community. So if you want to kind of be part of that, let us know. And just, yeah, just we'll pass it around as I keep chatting. So I guess let's start things off by getting some questions up on the board here that you guys have around health. Yeah, awesome.
It's about intermittent fasting and detoxing.
Sure.
And I know you have your own 15-day plan or weekly plans. Do you think it's better sustained periods of fasting or just once a week or twice a week when you can do it?
Yeah, I can talk about intermittent fasting and in those specifics. Yeah. And many iterations, and by the way, there is an open forum covering this topic, so if you ever have time to peek at it, it's good. Yeah. Yes?
I'd like to learn more about the pathway of how food causes a mood disorder,
Yeah.
and how that happens, and if it's like a leaky blood-brain barrier, or is it a leaky gut, or
Yeah.
what, because I had my daughter tested, and one particular thing she didn't show up sensitive to at all, but she has a very severe emotional reaction to
Oh,
food, but
okay.
it didn't show up in the test.
Okay,
So, like,
sure. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
very much part of this topic, so we'll hopefully get to that, and if I don't, let me know if you want to learn more. Yeah, Fran?
Mast cell activation disorder?
Mast cell activation disorder. Sure. I can elaborate more. Yeah, what else? What other questions out there? Yes? Yeah.
Is there any, I guess, truth to the prebiotics to get the good bacteria to thrive in the gut, so you don't crave the sugary foods?
Okay. Yeah, I can talk about prebiotics and how to understand them better. Sure. Yes.
Last time you talked about L-glutamine, and I was wondering, there's two things that you're supposed to do in taking it, that I think one you said and one I read on the label or something is like an hour after, after meals,
Yeah.
between meals, whatever. And then the other after a workout. And I was wondering how important those parameters are, and if you can't, if it doesn't fit there, is it better to just take it anyway?
Yeah. Certainly, I'll just answer that pretty quickly. It's most ideal to space between meals, but it's still efficacious, just slightly less so if it's with food. Because then your gut's treating it a little more like nutrition versus a therapeutic agent to use in those other actions. What else? Other questions? Yes.
Does leaky gut kind of spark autoimmune diseases or?
Okay, yeah, I could touch on that. Okay, good one. What else is there? Yes.
I have a cousin about retirement age that just moved here, lived in the Washington area all of her life. She's in a brand new home that was just built, and they're building around her.
Yeah.
She's had a really bad cold that she couldn't shake, and when she went in today, he thought it was a reaction to the chemicals in a newly built house,
Sure.
and she might not feel real good for quite a while because it's present there, and they're building around her, and that was kind of new for me because she's had it a long, long time, and it's not having the energy which she has had before.
Yeah.
So that was new.
So asking about understanding environmental or chemical sensitivity?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Okay.
was curious about that.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay, cool. What else? What other questions are there? Yes.
Could you speak to the, sometimes people assume as you age that you're going to have a little bit of incontinence, or a little leaking when you sneeze or what have
Yeah.
you. But I remember reading something years ago, and I can't find the source again, where they said really there was something else you could do. It had something to do more with like chiropractic or
Sure.
or some other sort of addressing. It wasn't just suffer through it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some really good tools to talk about for incontinence. Yeah, what else? What other questions are there? Okay. Going once, going twice. Any more? Yeah.
The second line there, I don't know what that is.
Oh, we'll get to that. Yeah, it'll be at the end of the lecture, so if you want to hang around at the end, we'll chat about it and I'll explain it. Okay, cool. So, today's topic, gut-brain connection, near and dear to my heart or to my stomach, I don't know. But, so I'm a naturopathic physician. I'm trained to the same degree in terms of breadth of training as a medical doctor, but I would say one of the things very central to the education and practice of a naturopathic physician is the awareness of how intestinal health influences our health globally, or I would say that the gut is the seat of health in many ways. And so, from that standpoint, this topic is really fun and easy for me to talk about because inevitably every conversation I have with a patient, I think, at least touches on the state of one's digestive system. And so I want to, even though this is called gut-brain connection, we're going to start in the gut realm and really understand that a little bit and move toward, as we get a greater understanding, how that relates to cognitive brain health and really a whole host of other more systemically oriented processes. So I do just really want to start from the beginning because I don't want to assume any knowledge of how digestion works. We'll do a quick kind of top of the tube to the bottom of the tube to get oriented. So when you eat a bite of food, you masticate it with your teeth, put saliva around it. That saliva actually drops in some digestive enzymes, which helps break down starches. You hopefully chew that food well so you can digest it better. And you swallow it down the esophagus, which is involuntary muscles that propel that broken down food into your stomach. There's a little valve at the bottom of your esophagus called the lower esophageal sphincter opens up, lets things into the stomach, and when everything hits the stomach, you are in a pretty hostile environment. The pH of the stomach is like 1. It will dissolve a tooth in about 24 hours. It's the hardest bone in your body, so that's how intensive an environment that is. That is with a healthy stomach acid. Talk more about that. So big action of the stomach in digestion is breakdown of proteins and extraction of minerals, vitamins, and it's actually a big defense barrier because microbes don't survive very well in the stomach with all that acid. Food hangs out there for about an hour, and then it gets dumped into the small intestine. Small intestine, if you stretched it out, it's about 25 feet long. So it's this really windy thing in your abdomen. And there's a lot of things going on in the small intestine. Our lecture will actually hone in mostly on the small intestine today. But I would say overarchingly, its primary purpose is that of absorption and breakdown of nutrients and water. And so there's 3 sections, the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. And as you go down, there's less absorption and more immune function, basically, towards the end of it. Then, after about 3 to 6 hours in the small intestine, food dumps out into the large intestine, or colon, which is about 3 or 4 feet long. And the main function of the colon is to absorb additional water and do a little bit of additional nutrient absorption, mostly through colon breakdown with the bugs that live in our colon, extracting more nutrients. And it's really where waste products go from liquid to solid, and then it's excreted. And that time in the colon is anywhere from 12 to 18, maybe 20 hours that food spends there. So this whole process in healthy digestion is anywhere between 18 and 36 hours is how long we're looking at of mouth to anus when you're digesting food. Now, in the middle of that, we have the small intestine, which is where we basically have to get a bunch of digestive juices in to break down the nutrients we're eating. So this is where 3 organs come into play: the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. And they all have a little sphincter that dumps from the pancreas all of your protein, carbohydrate, enzymes into the small intestine to help further the food breakdown process. And the liver dumps bile into the gallbladder, which is a little storage tank. And when you have a meal that contains fat, the gallbladder coordinates, squirts out a bunch of bile into the intestinal tract, and that helps break down and kind of forms micelles or soap bubbles around the fats in your diet so you can absorb them into your bloodstream. So that's kind of the process of digestion. So any big questions pop up so far that anyone wants clarification of? Okay, so we're going to kind of keep going inward here. So let's really focus in now on the small intestine, but really the small intestine and the colon. But there's a lot more going on in the small intestine than I've shared, and I want to kind of actually go into detail because it has everything to do with the gut-brain connection. So the big thing about the small intestine that science is beginning to teach us more and more and more about is this massive organ, essentially, our body contains, called the gut microbiome. So these are the trillions and trillions of microbes that live in your gut with you. We're in symbiosis with them, I would say. And there are 90% of the cells that exist within us, 90% of them are these bacteria and bugs in our gut. So I have a lecture of an open forum called 10% human, 90% gut bacteria, because really that's technically, from an organism standpoint, a cellular standpoint, what we are. So to give that perspective, those trillions of organisms, it's just to talk about how big of a role they play in health. And this is a place where scientifically we're beginning to understand this better, and that's a beginning scientifically, I would argue that in a clinical setting, from a conventional treatment paradigm or understanding, we're nowhere even close to the beginning understandings that the science is creating. And there's infinite more to learn, of course. So this microbiome is really, really important to understand if we're going to understand global health, and particularly the gut-brain connection. Because it turns out that these trillions of organisms have a huge role to play, first and foremost, in digestion and assimilation, but also in immune health, also in brain health. So let's kind of build into that. There's really two categories of flora we can break things down into. There is what are called commensal flora and opportunistic flora. And there's thousands of species of these. We know many of them, we don't know many of them still too. We're starting to learn how to map the gut genome too, and that's kind of exciting that that's coming about. But there's thousands of species, and the commensal ones are kind of like the good guys, the people on our team. They're the really friendly flora, and they're the ones we want to have most prominently balanced in the gut microbiome, in this ecology. The opportunistic flora, they exist in everybody in some quantity, but as a ratio, they're relatively minor players in the ecology of the gut. And so one that many people have heard about is called Candida, right? Many people have heard, oh, I have Candida issues, or I think I may have Candida issues. Candida, we all have Candida in our gut, okay? But when Candida gets really abnormally prominent and thrives in the gut, it gets out of balance, it becomes what's called opportunistic, and it can start to cause pathological effects in the human body, both in the gut but also systemically. Okay, so that differentiation point is important to be clear about. That we all have parasites, fungus, bad guy bacteria in our gut, things like Clostridium difficile or something, or E. coli. I think there was an outbreak with lettuce recently. But the idea here is that they're held in check by all the beneficial flora. Okay, any questions about that concept? Okay, so what these microbes do is actually, it turns out, a profound amount in relation to our digestion. So first of all, I mean, you could think of it as like a metaphor would be like they're a nice grass turf, like overlying the absorption layer of the gut. So they're a big protective barrier. So if any pathological compounds come into contact in the gut lining, because most of our exposure to the outside world is what we put in our mouth, then this big carpet or turf of beneficial gut flora have all sorts of defense mechanisms to block toxins, to block harmful microbes. So when that's intact, great. When it's not intact, problems can happen. Another thing they do is they're really critical in breaking down our food. So these microbes actually ferment a lot of the things we eat, including fiber, right? Soluble fiber is pretty exclusively broken down by these gut microbes. But they help break down protein, they help break down carbohydrates, they help break down fats. So again, when those are way out of balance and they're not there, we're having breakdown issues. What they're also doing is, as they're breaking them down, it turns out that the byproducts of those commensal or beneficial flora breakdown, the metabolic byproducts get fed toward the gut lining, and the what are called enterocytes, which are the cells that line the gut, where absorption happens, the gut bacteria feed them. Okay, so like literally, if we don't have healthy gut bacteria, we don't have a healthy gut lining, because that's how they get nutrition, these cells that line the gut. We're going to talk about terms like leaky gut and IBS and all these things. Well, the prominent feature there is a compromised gut lining, which really means compromised gut flora in a lot of ways. Okay, so these microbes are not only breaking down food, they're not only providing defense, but they're also keeping our absorptive lining healthy. And the other thing about that absorptive lining is that the end part of digesting specifically carbohydrates and proteins happens on that enterocyte lining. For example, all the cells that break down lactose are on that intestinal lining, that very thin layer. So if that layer is compromised, the first thing that gets swiped off is all of the enzymes that break down lactose. Okay, so many of our endogenous ways that we break down and assimilate our food relate to the health of that intestinal lining. And to give you guys a little perspective, those enterocytes, they're on these little finger-like projections called microvilli. So if you lay out the absorptive surface of the small intestine, of your own small intestine, it's the size of a football field. Okay, so that just giving you some perspective to how complex this organ system is in your body and the kind of relationships going on there. Okay. Any questions so far about this? Okay. So I've kind of given you, one other big feature, those gut microbes, super critical. They can actually synthesize a lot of vitamins and make accessible a lot of vitamins. So one of the big features we see with people with really major gut issues and compromised gut microbiome is vitamin deficiencies, mineral deficiencies. For example, these people with really major gut issues, a lot of them are anemic because a lot of the pathological or opportunistic microbes scavenge all of the iron from your diet. And like these kids, especially with really sick guts, really bad anemia. So you can get very nutrient depleted, which if we're driving towards this gut-brain health, very clearly the brain relies heavily on adequate supply of vitamins and minerals and nutrients. And if we're not absorbing and accessing them, then this is a big problem for cognition and brain health. So I guess the next question is, what happens when that microbiome gets out of balance? And we're going to talk about what the triggers are in a second. But what happens basically is those opportunistic flora start to thrive. Well, then we have compromised breakdown of foods. We have compromised nutrition to the cell, the enterocytes or the gut lining cells. So you start to get holes poked in the intestinal lining and you start to lose a lot of the enzymes associated with breaking down the food you're consuming. Those opportunistic microbes also put big gaps in that turf. So other toxins that are streaming through the gut can pierce through actually into the bloodstream and start to cause a systemic inflammatory or toxic overload reaction. Furthermore, those opportunistic microbes themselves, their metabolic byproducts, instead of being these really nice fuels for the intestinal cells, their metabolic byproducts are actually toxins. For example, when we talk, again, we can use Candida as an example, it's just an easy one. People will often report severe brain fog or feeling drunk after eating, especially carb meals. It's literally because the Candida is fermenting the food you're eating into alcohol, and you're getting inebriated by it, and that alcohol is moving into the bloodstream. So we're actually, and alcohol is a toxin, right? So these opportunistic microbes are deriving all these toxins as a relation to their metabolism. And the first place that gets hit is the gut, but then the gut gets compromised and we get systemic absorption of these compounds that lead to all the other syndromes and circumstances that we're going to talk about. Any questions so far? Okay. So then another thing that we really have to take into account here is the immune system, because there's an important layer to this, which is that 80% of our immune system is associated with our gut. It's called gut-associated lymphatic tissue. So when we talk about things like inflammation, pain, discomfort, redness, swelling, what we're really saying is there's inflammation going on somewhere in the body. Okay? And inflammation is the immune system out of balance. So that line of reasoning shows that if 80% of your immune system gets all of its intelligence from the gut and stays in balance as it relates to the gut, then if the gut's not in balance, there's a big problem. Now, the immune system very specifically derives its knowledge and its intelligence from, guess what? The gut microbiome, the bugs that live in our gut. And you can, I mean, it's very complicated, but you can really break this down into, you know, in a really simplified term, in what's called a Th1 immune response and Th2 immune response. So in a healthy immune system, these two responses are in balance. Meaning that the Th1 response is how we respond to invaders like bacteria and viruses. We mount a Th1 response, and when we have allergies and asthma and, you know, environmental factors as well as parasites, we mount a Th2 response. But when the gut is compromised and the microbiome is compromised, this Th1, Th2 immunity gets way out of balance. And we activate the Th2 response way overly gets expressed. And this is where allergies, asthma, skin issues, eczema, hives, and a lot of cognitive issues are associated with an overactive Th2 immune response. So I wanted to kind of put that little layer of the immune system. This isn't really an immune system lecture, but because inflammation is such a big driver of gut health and systemic health, we have to appreciate the immune system's role and ultimately how the immune system is centered in the gut, right? I think someone had a question about autoimmune diseases. Well, absolutely, from that standpoint, you know, we're looking at immune dysregulation as a big trigger of autoimmune disease, for another example. So, again, not focusing on the immune system today, but just to bring that into the conversation. Any questions so far?
What is Th2, what does that stand for? Is it this term? It's not like sometimes.
Yeah, it maybe once upon a time in med school I knew the exact word for it. It has to do with the different type of interleukins, which are different types of lymphocyte and immune cells that get activated.
So I would be.
Yeah, yeah. There's macrophages, there's mast cells, someone said, there's antigen-presenting cells, there's histamines, there's all sorts of immune cells. It's a huge conversation, but yeah, so this just has to do with the different types of immune cells activated and how they respond in the body. Yeah. Right.
What's the source of the good cells?
The source of the good...
The flora.
The good flora. Yeah, great question. I'm glad you brought that up. So we have to say, well, how do we get here? How do we get to have these trillions of organisms? Well, it technically doesn't start till day one of our life. We don't actually have it in utero, because when we go through the vaginal canal and delivery, we get seeded with the hopefully healthy vaginal flora as mom delivers. Now, already some people are thinking, oh, well, what if you're delivered by C-section? Yeah, that's a problem, right? Because all of that seeding of the beneficial flora doesn't happen from day one. So already you're maybe set on a trajectory where you're predisposed to dysbiosis, right? Flora out of balance. That's really a thing to consider, and we talk about that a lot in my babies that I see that are delivered C-section is, you know, how do we get caught up or, you know, mitigate that concept. But yeah, so we get seeded from day one with hopefully beneficial flora, and that seeding populates the gut ongoing, and mother's breast milk has a huge influence on emphasizing the commensal or beneficial flora. So again, when we're not breastfed, and especially when we're having, you know, cow dairy formula, it can really start to skew the microbiome in not such a good way. But breast milk really helps facilitate that. And then as we go along, I mean, it's a good segue into the next part of the conversation. What influences the health of the gut flora? So, I mean, most prominently, pretty obvious, right? The food we eat. What do those bugs eat? They eat what we eat. So if we're giving it all the stuff that the commensal beneficial really like fiber, which is in whole foods, vegetables, whole fruits, right, then you tend to promote the really beneficial species. If we're eating sugar and processed food and refined starches, we're probably going to emphasize and really overemphasize supporting the opportunistic species. And we'll get a lot more into that at the end of the lecture when we talk about treatment. But yes, certainly one of the biggest influencer, I would say, is the food we eat. And also kind of how we eat it too, because like I was saying, if we hopefully chew our food well, if you don't chew your food, or if you're all stressed out when you're eating, you're not going to really assimilate food as well, and that's also going to skew towards the wrong bugs too. That's another topic, but basically, one of the big things that disorients and predisposes to dysbiosis is predominantly eating processed food, starches, and chemically fortified foods. I mean, I shouldn't even call them foods, right? Because they're not really food. They're food-like chemical substances, which unfortunately is probably between 60 and 80% of the standard American diet, right? So that's a big problem we have, is that we don't eat whole foods. It doesn't taste as good, it's not convenient, we don't have the education or the nurture from our parents to reinforce that, so it's a pretty tough setting to get healthy gut flora if that's how we predominantly eat. But there are some other big forces that influence the health of our microbiome or cause dysbiosis. And I'll probably move through order of importance. We're talking about the gut-brain connection. So here's a way where, it's very reciprocal. So turns out that the brain has a really powerful way to influence gut health. And the big driver of that is the stress response. Okay, so everyone knows the term fight or flight, right? Right. So running from a tiger because you're going to get killed, and so you got to save your life. Well, physiologically, that's a really important adaptive mechanism. So what our brain tells our neurological system and our circulatory system, when we're trying to save our life, what don't we need to do? Well, we don't need to fight that cold we have going on. We don't need to reproduce, right? We want to just live first, then we can worry about that. And we don't really need to digest, that vegetable that you were eating, or that handful of nuts that you ate, right? Because if you're not going to be around, the digestion part doesn't matter. And the biggest part of the physiological response to fight or flight, in my clinical experience, is, shuts down the process of digestion neurologically and circulatory-wise. So you don't secrete any of your enzymes. You don't have any of the blood flow to the gut. And this is a huge, huge problem for a lot of people. And if it was our normal physiological adaptation, that maybe 1% to 2% of our conscious life, we are in that mode, no big deal. But in our culture, in our society, we have what's called chronic sympathetic dominance, or chronic fight or flight. So people are in this mode all day long, continually. And so, yes, gut issues are going to arise when that context is in play. And it's hard for me to really discern at this point in my career which is more prominent, the food issue or the chronic fight or flight issue, in terms of what impacts people's health more. It's hard to say. It's very different for each person. But recognize that signaling pathway to the neurological system, to the circulatory system, is facilitated by our mind, right? It's in anticipation. It's in anticipation of something bad happening. So the way with which we learn how to understand that, observe that, and transform that pattern, and move our neurological and mental state into the rest and digest mode, which is where we should be spending 90 to 95% of our time, is really critical to this whole how the gut flora is balanced and oriented. Yeah, in the back.
What are some of the things you do to make people more parasympathetic in your practice?
Many, but I can share a few. Exercise, belly breathing or triggering the vagus nerve, which is the major nervous tone to the rest and digest, called parasympathetic. So belly breathing is really great for that. All of the movement-based practices that are associated with belly breathing, really good for that. I love castor oil packs, which is topical application of castor oil to facilitate that. And really uniquely to each individual, understanding what causes their mind to be out of integrity or misaligned or have irresolution, basically, which is very unique to each patient that I work with in terms of the forces in their life, and helping them have a different perspective or a different way of responding to one's environment through, and another obvious practice is meditation or mindfulness or spirituality, many tools in those realms that can be helpful too. And I have some definite open forums. I love talking about this because I think it's such a big player in health, so lots of ways to learn more about it. I'm going to leave it at that for today because we really want to hit a lot of topics. So it's this interesting, bi-directional thing, right? We're recognizing how much the gut impacts the mind, but man, the mind really impacts the gut too, from that lens. If we go beyond that piece, then we have to recognize how, sadly, our modern way of intervening medically in our health hugely impacts the gut microbiome. And I think I'll start with the obvious, antibiotics, right? You having a urinary tract infection or a chest cold or sinusitis or earache, and you take an antibiotic, it might clear up temporarily that acute symptom. But what you're also doing is carpet bombing your whole gut microbiome and wiping everything out, and then saying, okay, well, let's see how it all grows back. And most of the time when you do that, opportunistic species start to take on a much bigger prominence and activity level and dominance in the microbiome. So the irony here, right, we were talking about how the immune system gets all of its intelligence from the balance of the gut flora. So if you have acute immune issue and you take an antibiotic, you may temporarily solve the acute immune issue, but the downstream consequence is you compromise your immunity further. So I see people all the time who are coming in with, well, I've had 10 sinus infections in the last 10 months and they're getting worse and worse, and I've taken this many rounds of antibiotics and I feel awful and my gut's messed up now. And it's because our methodology of simply treating the symptom or the bug without understanding the broader context is sadly still not regular practice in our medical system. And so antibiotics cause huge harm to the gut and consequently to our global health, and they can really impact the gut flora. That's not the only medication that we have to worry about. Steroids, prednisone is one that probably most people have heard of, cortisone, especially oral steroids or IV steroids where they get all the way into the gut. Topical still has a problem, but not quite as bad. Steroids are designed to suppress the immune system. So again, like antibiotic, they're a symptomatic treatment. The immune system is overactivated because of something, but rather than trying to get to the root of what's overactivating the immune system, let's suppress it with steroids. Well, when you suppress with steroids, it also in the gut is very suppressive to the balance of the microbiome, and it tends to predispose those opportunistic species, which are usually held in pretty tight check by the other flora in the immune system. It allows them to flourish. So steroids can really compromise that dynamic. Birth control, another one that's just really awful for the gut microbiome, really distorting to how that balance is achieved and how we can cultivate commensal species. Really big problem there. antifungals for the same reason as antibiotics, anti-inflammatories like aspirin and NSAIDs or ibuprofen. Really irritating, inflammatory, disruptive effect to the gut lining into the microbiome. So really big problems when we're using those chronically. Chemotherapeutics for people with cancer, that's a very smaller topic, but really hostile to the microbiome. And there are many more that we can build off of from there, but those are just a few. And again, I'm going to kind of leave it in that place because I think that's a really good kind of just overview. Of course, many other forces can impact the microbiome, et cetera, et cetera. So, questions so far? Pause for a second. Yes.
I have one, and it might be insignificant, but you know, at a certain age, your doctors recommend you always take a baby aspirin every day.
Yeah.
And you might do it for years and years. Is that minimal, or?
Well, I don't want to sound judgmental here, but it's kind of a prevention strategy. And there's a mild anti-inflammatory effect of aspirin, and it does have a blood thinning effect. So the concept, I think, is that thinning the blood makes it less likely for a cardiovascular event. Unfortunately, those aspirins do a lot of other impacts, and I would say one of them is what they do to the gut microbiome, which isn't appreciated at all through that recommendation. So I'm not generally a fan of it unless there's a strong clinical indication, like some major cardiovascular risk factors that make me think it's a useful therapy. And even then, I have a bunch of other therapeutics that would achieve what aspirin does without the side effects. In the back, yeah.
Does blood thinners do the same kind of thing?
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't put them in the same categories I've been talking about. Yeah. Yes.
What is your belief on probiotics?
We'll get to probiotics. Yeah. So when I talk about treatments of things we can do to make our microbiome and our gut healthier, that's part of the discussion. Yeah. Yes.
Would you have a moment to just maybe line out a couple of things that would be replacement for baby aspirin in regard to someone who's had stroke?
Yeah, I really like, go do some research about nattokinase. Nattokinase. Yeah, it's a really good thing to read about. There's a lot of good science on it.
Can you spell that?
What?
Can you spell it?
Oh yeah, I'll write it down for you.
What about eating natto?
Yeah, for sure, if you like the taste of natto.
Yeah.
I can't do it myself, but that's why Japanese people have such incredibly low rates of heart disease and heart episodes. They eat a lot of natto. Okay, so let's kind of build out here now about the more systemic pieces. Okay, so let's get to the brain. So as we talked about, when we have a leaky gut because we have a compromised microbiome, that means we're absorbing things into our bloodstream that are not fully broken down. And if we have a compromised microbiome, we also have a lot of toxins being produced in the gut. And those toxins with the leaky membrane are also moving into the bloodstream. And once they get into the bloodstream, they can go anywhere. And of course, one of the places they do go is the brain. So you have these undigested food particles, you have these toxins, you have actual portions of some of these bacteria, and amongst all the other systemic things, rashes, joint issues, migraines, sinus problem, you name it, of all the systemic conditions derived by this concept. Also, there's a lot of consequences cognitively. So, one of the big things, I'm going to talk about this diet called GAPS diet, or gut and psychology syndrome. It's this pediatrician who observed that all these kids with all these cognitive conditions, autism, ADD, ADHD, dyslexia, etc., all of them have gut issues because they all have these leaky guts, and it turns out that all of these toxins and partially broken down foods going into the brain are creating all sorts of issues cognitively for them behaviorally. So that's essentially what we're talking about with the gut-brain connection, at least as it pertains to the gut moving to the brain, is all of these neurotoxic effects of these compounds. And then there's that second part I talked about right at the beginning, where if we are literally eating all the time, but we are nutrient starved, then the brain doesn't have the building blocks it needs to actually make the chemicals, the neurotransmitters, the hormones, the constituents to physiologically maintain function. So a lot of these kids and people just generally are malnourished, literally, because of the compromised breakdown and assimilation happening in their gut and the food they're eating. So that's another element to it too. And I can get really specific about the types of compounds, the types of neurotoxins. There are so many, and we're just learning more and more, that I don't know if I should go into a ton of detail about it, because it's just, we can essentially say that those compounds are a major driver. I think one of the interesting things to look at is the incomplete breakdown products of casein and gluten. Casein is the dairy protein in cow dairy, and gluten is one of the protein constituents or starch constituents of wheat products in all the processed foods they're in. Well, it turns out that these compounds bind opiate receptors in the brain if they're not broken down all the way. So they're called caseomorphines and gluteomorphines because they have a morphine-like structure. And so people like to say, yeah, like I am addicted to cheese or bread, and kids certainly are. Well, I mean, literally they are. It's like they're getting a fix when they have it because they're binding opiate receptors in the brain. Because they have these leaky guts and they're not breaking those compounds down all the way. And there's all sorts of physiological cascading effects that come from that too. So it's just an interesting thing to point out. It's literally, drug-like effects we're getting from these incompletely digested foods and these neurotoxins. Yeah. So conditions that I would really associate, or symptoms I should say, brain fog, fatigue, certainly depression and anxiety. I see tons of improvement with those conditions around healing the gut. Other kind of adult syndromes, I mean, certainly memory issues, aging issues, Alzheimer's, dementia, big players in this regard of the gut-brain connection. So I think really anything cognitively oriented, you could argue, has a pretty strong relationship to this concept. And some interesting, more recent research that I find fascinating is that we're actually starting to get some awareness that we always thought that microbes couldn't cross the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is kind of like the gut barrier, the intestinal enterocytes, very similar type of membrane. We're finding, well, guess what? If you have a leaky gut, most people have a leaky blood-brain barrier too. So the blood-brain barrier is supposed to really tightly regulate what can go into the brain because it's such an important set of tissues that can't be exposed to toxins. But it turns out that lots can get in there. Certainly things like alcohol or aldehydes or amines, which are some of these toxic breakdown products, really readily pass by. Other things more difficultly. But again, if you have a leaky gut, you probably have a leaky blood-brain barrier because the immune system is, overactivated and inflamed, and it's damaging the blood-brain barrier too, right? One of the things I haven't been talking about directly is a dysregulated immune system in and of itself can compromise the brain too. So it's not just the toxins in the partially broken down foods, it's actually this ramped up hyperactive immune system that's flooding immunological cells into the brain and disrupting function. So that's another big process to recognize too. Anyways, what I was getting to was that we actually have some preliminary interesting studies about microbes living in the brain. That we're actually finding bacteria and parasites and viruses that live there, and that actually we're not really learning a lot of their physiological roles yet. But literally, when we're talking about a gut microbiome, we're probably someday going to be talking about a brain microbiome. And once we learn how to study it better. And I like to say that all the other places that microbes live are a mirror to the gut, right? Because you have the trillions of organisms in the gut, but you have billions of organisms in your sinus passages, in your eyes, in your ear canals, in your urinary lining, in your vaginal lining. So all of these other associated membranes, so to speak, are basically mirroring reflections of what's going on in the gut microbiome. They're little like mini examples. So when we have issues in all those other tissues, ultimately to get to the curative part of it, we really have to look at the gut first and foremost. We can do treatments on those mucous membranes, but we still have to treat the gut to get to the causation, what's driving it. So just a little tidbit about this new research about the brain microbiome, which is kind of cool. So are people understanding why there's this maybe phrase of like, you know, the gut is your second brain? You appreciate that? Another part that's really helpful to know is that our hormones, serotonin, dopamine, 90% of serotonin is made in the gut, about 60% of dopamine is made in the gut, right? These are very much, actually, these are neurotransmitters, not hormones, but these neurotransmitters are really associated with, our well-being and happiness, sleep-wake cycles, so many physiological actions. So, yeah, I mean, if you don't have a healthy gut, you're not going to have healthy serotonin. Certainly, if you have depression, you can give someone, a serotonin modulating, what we call neuroleptic drug, Prozac or Wellbutrin or something. And certainly that can maybe serve in some ways, but you're also giving just exquisitely massive amounts of neurotransmitters and saying, well, the desired effect is removing depression, say, but the other 50 effects that it has, we call them side effects, are also going to happen as a result of that. And by the way, you'll take that for the rest of your life. Or we could say, whoa, what's ongoing with your gut, and why aren't you making your own serotonin? Can we get that to start happening? And that's, very, very much, again, where one of those connections is with depression or the brain gut in relation to depression, for example. So again, appreciating a lot of the nutrients the brain needs comes from the gut. And so if we're not getting those nutrients, the brain's not going to function in a happy way. Any questions so far? Hey, John.
Okay, so when you do the CBC and test the blood, how do you test the flora? How do you test if the gut is healthy?
So, the one of the big next parts here is, well, is there a way to know about this? Symptoms can obviously tell you a lot. So if you get bloaty, if you get gassy, if you get, dyspepsia, heartburn, loose stools, changeable stools, abdominal pain, all these basically digestive symptoms, that could kind of give you a clue that this, imbalanced flora, leaky gut, etc., might really be going on. And that's clinically usually as far as I need to go to really get an idea of where to start with people. And then the interesting thing too is, some people will say, I don't have gut issues, and if I really spend a lot of time crying, I'll really find that, your feeling that your digestion is normal is not necessarily what I would call normal. So we have to work through that a lot. But secondarily, you actually may not have a lot of overt symptoms, but still have a lot of these processes going on. And that has to do with how sensitive you are to your body, how well you observe, as well as just, how each unique body manifests vulnerability. A lot of people don't manifest dysfunction in their gut. They manifest it in another organ system. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at the gut always. At least that's my bias, and I'll admit that that's a bias. So, anyways, I want to kind of answer Johnny's question, which is, how do you test? If you wanted to go further to really do like in-depth assessment, it's kind of pricey, but certainly you can do it. You can do a lot of different types of stool testing. There's different degrees of stool testing. You can do literally culture out the microbes in your stool. You can do DNA probes that will amplify the DNA of certain microbes, so it's a little more comprehensive. Also a lot more expensive to do it that way. There are now specialized labs that will map your DNA through, or map your microbe genome of your gut through DNA probes. There's a few companies do that. I don't use them. And then there are, other ways to test like output of your digestive organs, like pancreatic enzymes. You can look for what's in the stool in terms of if you have too much fat in your stool, right? You're not absorbing fat. So you can start to really get a window into some of this stuff in terms of doing stool testing. You can also do breath testing, which shows a little bit more about the small intestine, specifically when opportunistic species are overgrown in the small intestine. You can do hydrogen and methane breath tests. You eat lactose solution and breathe into a little specimen and send it to a lab, and they measure the metabolic breakdown products of the microbes. So that's a test I do sometimes. You can do all sorts of other tests related to gut barrier function, like mannitol, lactulose testing. There's a few leaky gut tests you can do. Again, I don't really find I need to do them that often. So if we really get stuck with someone for doing all the therapeutics, if we're working with the mind, body, both directions, food, healing the gut, I rarely see needing to reflex to these. But sometimes when people have done foreign travel or we're really stuck and we're really worried, and it's really going to clinically change how I treat, then I'll look for it and test. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned the breakdown of the casein and gluten.
Yes.
Attaching the opioid receptors.
Sure.
So my daughter has a very angry response.
Uh-huh.
How is that different? I mean, it's obviously she's not getting a happy response.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't necessarily say just because it's opiate receptors that it causes a happy response. And understand there might be a very transient response. I hate to use the analogy of an addict, but right after you have a really strong addiction, I mean, the palliation or the fix is basically just like that long before then they're not well. And there's also a lot of other physiological consequences beyond just binding the opiate receptor of how that dysregulates neurotransmitter firing and therefore consequently mood.
So is that what's happening? It's interrupting her neurotransmitters?
I would say that's one way to look at it, and all the toxins associated with taking on those foods too. You could use that as a very simplification. Yeah. Yeah. So, other questions so far of our chat? Okay. So so we talked about some testing methods. I do mostly through history in clinical and observation as well as physical exam. There's some really great functional assessment stuff I can do to really look at what's going on with the intestinal system. But then, I mean, the fun part is let's talk about treatment and what do you do about this? So what if you're suspicious you have dysbiosis for various reasons? Then what are we going to work on? Well, again, we're going to make sure we're not continuing exposure to any compounds that are problematic from at least a medicinal standpoint. So let's find a way to treat things without antibiotics, antifungals. Let's not be using steroids, not by using ibuprofen, not be using birth control, all those things. We're really going to work on the mind-body connection, right? So we talked about sympathetic dominance, we talked about fight or flight, We talked about parasympathetic tone, some of the tools that can really facilitate that. Really understanding that uniquely to each individual is super critical. And honestly, it's probably the hardest part of helping people get to the root of things and be cured, is working on that component in terms of how it influences our health. But we will do that in trying to improve this functionality. And then the relationship with food becomes a really important player, right? If we keep bringing the things in that are going to facilitate the opportunistic microbes, we're going to just keep that dysbiosis in check, no matter how many medicinal compounds we give. And I'm going to talk about those too, but obviously the big thing is what's perpetuating the pattern, right? What's the obstacle to cure? So food's a biggie. So as I said, it turns out that those opportunistic microbes really like starch and sugar. So that's where we got to start looking, is those things. And so, you know, what is starch and sugar? Well, sugar's kind of obvious. It's, you know, things that taste sweet in concentrated forms. I mean, I'm not going to include fruit here unless maybe we're talking about like grapes, pretty concentrated sugar. But, you know, we're talking about fruit juices certainly. We're talking about soda. We're talking about alcohol. Different ones worse than others. Beer and liquor much worse than dry red wine, but also alcohol is sugar. We're talking about all processed food pretty much. So anything that comes in a bag, a package, a box, that has more than one ingredient on it. If it has a label, I mean, I appreciate people saying I'm starting to read labels, but my next statement is, why are you having to read labels? Because if you're really eating whole foods, which is what we should be eating, you don't need to read any labels. Yeah, so anything that has multiple ingredients. And so we're talking about, right, how does that pertain to starches? So we're talking about cereals, pastas, breads, bagels, chips, crackers, any sort of prepackaged food, basically. We're talking about, as a food group, we're talking about all grains. We're talking about, and by the way, I include two very important compounds as grains, which are potatoes and corn, which derivatives in terms of processed food, there's tons of things that are gluten-free, that are processed food, that are corn and potato derived. And certainly, you know, processed rice stuff too. Rice tends to be less reactive, but in its processed form, it's basically the same deal. So, starchy beans and lactose-containing dairy. So what these are all called are fermentable carbohydrates. So they are starches that get fermented and metabolized by gut microbes. And if it's one thing if you're eating a little bit of quinoa and wild rice and steel-cut oats, beans that start dry that you cook, and those kind of things. But again, that's not what most of us are doing. We're eating like massive loads of sugar and processed starches, and so that's really where the opportunistic species take off, and where this leaky gut situation arises. So essentially, that's really the category that we would want to highly restrict if we're looking at leaky gut and significant intestinal compromise in terms of what's perpetuating the situation. But then we have to appreciate if someone has a leaky gut, they might not be able to break down more complex foods. So dairy is an example. Dairy is a very, very complex food to break down. You need really good enzymatic support, really good gut flora to break it down. So a lot of these people, even if they have a healthy gut, that's one thing, but if they don't, breaking down dairy is pretty difficult, and probably initially will really want to minimize that and avoid that. People with really unhealthy guts and really bad, leaky gut, all the fiber that I talked about is so good for your gut flora. If your gut is that compromised and you have that skewed of dysbiosis, you're going to have a lot of trouble with fiber. And so a lot of people will report, vegetables make me feel awful. And so then we have to go through a very meticulous way of rebuilding gut health that actually starts with really minimal fiber intake. That's in really more severe cases typically. So, you know, I guess, what does that really leave here, right? Thanks, guys. What does that really leave in terms of what we want to focus on? Well, first of all, we talked about whole foods, right? That concept. And whole foods usually contain a lot of fiber. None of the nutrients have been stripped away. And most whole foods are not just loaded with starches. Specifically, you know, the ones to really emphasize, fibrous vegetables. So your leafy greens, your cruciferous, your, you know, I mean, there's hundreds of them literally, but all of your chewy vegetables are ones to emphasize to really help make the gut flora happy. When your digestion is more compromised, in a cooked form is usually better to start with because raw is more difficult to digest. We would then add to that category whole fruits, certainly. The really sugary ones like grapes I mentioned or dates, probably not as big of an emphasis. We would go into the category of really good plant-based proteins, so nuts and seeds. Roasted or soaked usually is the best way to assimilate them. Raw is more difficult. We would go into beans, and again, from dry that have been really soaked and then cooked down gets all of the irritating compounds off, but again, some people with compromised gut are going to have trouble with beans. But that's generally a good whole food, lots of fiber, etc. Then we have our really clean animal proteins. So specifically sheep and goat dairy is probably better if you're going to do dairy, but usually at the beginning is not the best idea. And then you have your animal proteins. Probably the easiest to digest are eggs and whitefish. But then building out from that, we could go into, you know, clean organic poultry, and then maybe grass-fed four-legged. So lamb, beef, but clean sources. And again, cooking technique makes a big difference. So now there's another layer to this, which is, well, oh, you said beans, but I know garbanzo beans make me feel really bad. Okay, well, yeah, there's another complication and layer to this, which is we are all unique. So individually, we perhaps have sensitivities to different foods. And some of those sensitivities are just innate. Like, even though garbanzo beans is intrinsically a healthy food, some people just aren't going to have the enzymes, and their immune system is going to see it as a hostile compound. And so we're not going to break it down well. And it can certainly contribute to dysbiosis. So we have to individualize nutrition for everybody. I'm giving you some broad guidelines, but I just want to give a caveat to that that says that these general guidelines are not a one-size-fits-all. And one of the ways I start to kind of get a little more personal about that with people is to use our blood type to give us some genetic information about which foods were more well-suited to break down. And I think I've done 2 open forums on that. There's really good lectures on talking about the science of that, and etc. But I just wanted to make sure we reference that there is not a universal diet that works best for everybody. That we want to really individualize that guidance. And I do that with everybody I work with. So let's kind of jump ahead now to what is an actual diet that I feel like directly treats dysbiosis and leaky gut. It's kind of building off of what we talked about, but I mentioned this gut and psychology syndrome, or GAPS. I'm a really big fan of it. I'm a big fan of it for a few reasons. One reason I'm a big fan of it is because it has an introductory diet associated with it that helps really compromised people. So it's a really well laid out format to logically, and in my understanding of gut physiology, rebuild the gut from a really depleted state. So there are stages to the introductory diet. Most other diets out there, there's no such thing as introductory stages. And so I'm very appreciative of that element. I'm also appreciative of the compounds in it that specifically are food-derived that heal the gut. The number 1 compound that I'm going to reference is bone broth. People are probably familiar with it. It's known it's not the stuff you buy at Costco that's called bone broth. That doesn't count. It's ideally homemade, and it's taking the bones and joints and skin of chicken or turkey or beef, and it's rendering it down and extracting that liquid as a medicinal substance that has all sorts of constituents to repair all of those enterocytes in gut lining that's become compromised. And it can be usually formatted in soups with meat and veggies in it. So it's a really great gut healing compound, and it's food-based, which I'm always a fan. I want to use as few medicinals as possible, and usually, kind of food as medicine and nature as medicine as much as I can. So I like the bone broth emphasis in this diet. But go ahead.
Do you have a vegan option for, because I've heard a lot of people say bone broth is important for the leaky gut.
Sure.
But if you're vegan?
Yeah, if I was treating a vegan person, I would obviously be using a very different treatment strategy. It would probably involve juicing and a lot of pre-digested foods, like a lot of smoothies of very specific ingredients, usually fruits and plant proteins, and vegetable juices would probably be one of the methodologies I'd use. And avoiding all the inflammatory stuff. Yeah. So essentially what the GAPS premise is, I'll just say what you can't do, and it's basically the fermentable carbohydrates. So it's all of your grains, all of your starchy beans, all of your lactose-containing dairy, and all processed food and sugar. Honey is acceptable, a little bit of dry red wine is acceptable. There's a few little places in there that you can do it, but yeah, you're not eating grains, including potato and corn and sweet potato, and you're not eating most beans, and you're not eating processed food, and a good subset of dairy. So that's what you would give up, so to speak, in taking on this protocol. And most people, I find, depending on the severity, will need to do this anywhere from 1 to 6 months, typically, is what I'll see. And it depends on the chronicity and the age of the person. Kids respond a lot faster. They've had chronic disease for a lot less time, so they're much more vital. Individuals in their latter decades can take a lot longer. And so, it's something you really have to get your mind wrapped around, that this is a lifestyle you're going to be adopting, because the gut doesn't heal overnight. But it's very effective. I've had a lot of success with it. I find people with O blood types do particularly well with it. People with A blood types can do well with it, but it's a little heavy on the animal proteins. So, and there's lots of guidance around it. I've created some really good handouts that are very helpful to patients. There's the book itself, Gut and Psychology Syndrome. A lot of the concepts we talked about today are part of the first chapters of that book. And there's all sorts of resources on the internet. So that's the one that I really like. And probably if you really wanted to do a take-home of, well, what can I do to make my gut healthier? You could move toward this concept. Maybe you say, oh, well, I'm just going to stop eating processed food. Great, that'll probably solve 80% of the problems. And in most people who don't have really bad leaky gut, that's probably sufficient to make a massive difference. Okay, so don't kind of make it be like, oh, well, I need to go do the GAPS diet. That's the only way I'll have a healthy gut. I don't think so. I think the majority of my patients can get a very healthy gut by following their genetic-specific guidance and eating a mostly whole foods diet that balances healthy carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Yes?
What was the name of that book again?
Gut and Psychology Syndrome, or GAPS. And the author is called Natasha Campbell McBride, is hyphenated last name. Yes?
Did you say no sweet potato?
No sweet potato.
And, and what about maple syrup?
No maple syrup. Honey is your main sweetener. And of course, you can do GAPS wrong. I'll have families come back and they're trying really hard, and I acknowledge that. But it's like, oh yeah, we got these, honey ball desserts that they eat all day long, and we're doing almond flour pancakes with gobs of honey on it, and and we're doing tons and tons of fruit, and so it's kind of like, you know, the sugar addiction is still there, and the carb addiction is still there, but it's like better than it was, but we still need to reorient more. So, you know, you can always manipulate any diet you do, and in the end, I also want to make a caveat and say, if emotionally you are feeling deprived, you're feeling really down, you're feeling self-judgmental, you're feeling like the joy has left life by doing something like this, then it's probably not the right thing for you to do, and we should work on the relationship with food first and gradually build towards where you need to get to. Right? I mean, I have people coming in who are going to be much worse served by being given a really restrictive diet than if we just say, hey, let's work on the more central issues of what's impacting your health and not judge yourself so harshly about what you're eating. Because self-judgment can be such a big problem for people. And let's face it, we have addictions to these foods. Everybody does. So changing, you know, breaking an addiction is hard enough, but breaking addiction to something you have to be around every day is really hard. So have a lot of appreciation personally, and for the many hundreds of patients I've treated, about, you know, what it takes to manifest complex change in your life. And that goes for every element of health, but diet is a big one. So I understand what I'm asking people, and I think that's a real advantage of my profession and the model of my practice, is people come in wanting to be empowered to get to the root of things, and they don't just want a medicine to treat the symptom. Or if they do, I share with them that's not really how I do things, because I think that it drives the disease process deeper if you just palliate the symptoms. So, and people are really motivated most of the time, and if they're struggling with it and they come back, it's like, oh, well, you know, tell me how it can be helpful to you, right? So it's a journey, and I always make the point of writing, work on this at your pace, right? Because it's a unique process for each person. So hopefully that feedback is something you hear here when I'm talking about these very specific dietary guidances. In the back?
What do you suggest for, I guess, one would be like migraine, but people who are working through this and getting off sugar and getting off stimulants and all that stuff,
Sure.
and getting bad headaches, and not wanting to do Tylenol or Motrin, what do you suggest for getting through the headache part?
Hydration and circulation are really important, right? Because in a way, you're dumping toxins. So, so circulation helps, you know, toxins to get to the organs of elimination. Hydration helps flush it. So we're really leaning in there. Circulation, exercise, contrast, hot, cold bathing, I really like. You know, headache has a lot of causes, but rest is probably the best medicine. So if you're really detoxing, giving yourself that grace to have downtime to just kind of be with the pain a little bit and rest and sleep, there's not any magic medicine for it. And if you have to use those agents to cut the edge of it, it's not going to derail the process. So, and that's not going to last indefinitely. That'll be a few days at the most for that. And just going slow. Maybe you make the changes slow. Like, I know that I'm super sensitive to caffeine, and if I even have like 8 ounces of coffee a day, and I do that, I don't not drink caffeine, but when I get off of it, and I do periodically, I have to like really meter it down. Otherwise, if I just stop doing it, I'll get a headache and it doesn't feel good. So sometimes gradual change is a wiser way to go. Yeah. Yes.
What is your opinion of intermittent fasting or monthly 2 or 3 day fasting?
Monthly 2 or 3 day fasting. Well, again, I'm going to cover that in just a couple of minutes when I get through the lecture, because that's one of the additional topics, but I'm going to stick on the gut-brain stuff for a sec.
Okay.
But certainly I'll say that fasting can be valuable for healing the gut, because if you give the gut a break, it can actually repair itself, right? So our modern society also is eating constantly. We're eating from when we wake up to when we go to sleep, all throughout the day. And then your body's constantly digesting. So all the repair processes that need to go on in the gut can't really be achieved if you're constantly digesting. So one of the ways I really work with people in healing their gut is we work on fasting protocols. And juice fasting is a really good way to do fasting because you get nutrients, but they're passively absorbed. So you don't have to break them down. The first stage of the introductory GAPS diet is drinking bone broths all day and pre-digested food, basically. So you're going kind of on gut rest while you're doing stage 1 if you're really compromised. So from that standpoint, I really like fasting, intermittent fasting, to be a supporter of intestinal healing. And generally speaking, I think most people eat way too often. We're designed physiologically to go many days without any food, and we adapt very well physiologically to that. We have all sorts of innate mechanisms built in for that. But our mental fear about fasting is pretty profound because of the culture we've been raised in. So working through that is the hard part. Yeah. Other questions? In the back.
Would that be basically the Atkins induction phase?
I'm not super familiar with that protocol. It's kind of gone out of favor. It's more of a older.
Exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, a lot of broths and maybe just pre-digested meats.
0 carbs, 0 sugar.
Yeah.
For 2 weeks.
Yeah, you may be talking a little more about ketosis, but that's that's more of a metabolic thing. Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Just a second in the back there.
Would you comment about like Whole30 or paleo diet? Is that?
Yeah, really good tools, right? Whole foods. I made that statement that if you just ate whole foods, went from processed foods and sugar to whole foods, probably 80% of people would have dramatic improvements. And that's really what paleo and Whole30 is doing. I mean, it's a great concept. It's simple, it's straightforward. It doesn't really address individual food intolerances. And for people with really compromised guts, it still allows some difficult to digest foods and some foods that are fermentable carbohydrates. But overall, it's great, yeah. Yes. Yeah.
What about cereals? What about whole oats? Is that?
Yeah, so steel cut oats are, as I said, in a balanced diet, I feel like whole grains are probably acceptable in moderate amounts. If you were to do this gut healing diet I'm talking about, no.
What about like Greek yogurt with very few other ingredients?
Yeah, Greek yogurt on GAPS diet is acceptable. Yeah, and again, you can read all about the diet in terms of the specifics about it. There's a lot of information online. Yes.
How do you yourself discern whether you have like a serious gut problem or
so
like more compromised, or not that compromised?
Again, it's a very individual question, and I spend a lot of time. I spend an hour and a half with each new patient to assess their overall health, and a big part of that assessment is understanding their intestinal health. And there's a lot that goes into that. Yeah. Yes.
Where does IBS fall into this discussion?
Yeah, IBS is just, it's a junk term to encapsulate all sorts of different digestive patterns, alternating diarrhea, constipation, abdominal pain, bloating, gas. These are all symptoms that if you have X number of criteria, it's considered IBS.
So it's not really a separate condition that you're testing?
No, it's not. I would say that all of these gut symptoms could be a feature of IBS, and I really don't like the term. I think it's kind of meaningless. Okay. If you have intestinal issues, you have IBS. I mean,
so if somebody's been told they have IBS, it's not like you're being diagnosed with cancer.
No.
It's something that's just a condition that you can change the functioning of by changing the health of your gut?
Yeah, I would say that a better term would be you have dysbiosis, right? Because today's conversation is about how the microbiome, the gut flora, is really what drives intestinal health. So you could say, oh, I have this, and this digestive symptom. I have dysbiosis. I have imbalanced flora. That would be a better word to use, I think.
And so then, when we talk about leaky gut, that's when the membrane itself has been compromised. And so if we take these suggested treatments, how are we actually healing that? Are we healing that, or we're just improving the environment for the functioning to be better?
Well, so yeah, you are healing it, right? Because when you rebalance the gut flora by removing the foods that compromise it in the first place, and by restoring the friendly flora and bringing in the right nutrients that feed that flora, it starts to feed the sick intestinal lining that's been compromised.
So they can fill the holes.
Yeah, it regenerates and restores. Now, there are agents you can use, right? So the last part of this is, someone asked about probiotics. There's a lot of compounds we can talk about. We can just start with probiotics, right? Well, if we're trying to promote the commensal flora, do we want to maybe put some commensal flora in the gut? Yeah, I think so. There's one little caveat to that, which is, say you're just loaded with opportunistic flora. The analogy would be a lawn that has turned from grass to just fully weeds, and you try to sprinkle seeds of grass back in, and you're like, well, that's not working, right? That would be taking probiotics, but your gut is so out of balance that it's not seeding it, it's not shifting it. So sometimes with some of these patients, we actually have to use weed killers. We have to use antimicrobial herbs to knock down some of those opportunistic species before we repopulate the system. There are a lot of ways to do that, but that's something that I'll do in these more extreme cases. However, most people don't really need to go that far, and using probiotics or commensal beneficial flora can be really helpful. My favorite way to do that is food-based, right? So fermented cultured foods. There's all sorts of ways to do that. There's kombucha, there's fermented vegetables, there's fermented dips, there's miso, there is kimchi, there's sauerkraut. Some of these you can actually not even have to do yourself. I mean, this store sells tons of stuff that's fermented, and they have really nice live active cultures. There's really good yogurts, right, that are good cultured dairies. Specifically, you got to be really careful there, because most dairies are pasteurized, which means they destroy most of the bugs. But like one of the ones I really like they have here called Bulgarian yogurt is an actual 24-hour ferment. So I really like food-based probiotics because that's just a really good way, sustainably and food-based, to get probiotics. And you can get really high culture counts actually if you use them in your food. GAPS, one of the reasons I like the GAPS protocol, it goes into a lot of depth about fermented foods and how to use them. If you're like, oh, I don't like the taste of fermented foods, or man, that's a hassle, or too expensive, or whatever, then you can take probiotics, but you have to be kind of picky about that, in my opinion. And this is where pretty much every natural medicine, the FDA doesn't regulate it, not that it would know how to, but the problem is anybody can sell anything. So they did a study where they checked at a health food store, 40 probiotics, and 34 of them had no live colonies in them. So probiotics is particularly one of the realms of supplements where you have to be really choosy about them. I think good probiotics need to be refrigerated unless they're soil-based, and they need to have a pretty broad spectrum of commensal flora or friendly flora. So usually I would say to actively heal the gut, we're wanting at least 20 billion organisms. For maintenance, we can do as little as 5 to 10 billion. And we want to make sure there's, at the very least, lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, which are two of the greatest beneficial flora. And then there's, many, many more. And again, there's a lot of layers. We could talk a lot about probiotics, but it's definitely a good tool. And I would say everybody to have a healthy gut should be eating fermented food or taking a probiotic to really keep your gut seated correctly and promoting those commensal or beneficial flora. Prebiotics are the things that the probiotics eat. And really, you can get that all food-based too, right? All of your soluble fiber are prebiotics, right? So your beans and your whole grains and some of your vegetables have a lot of prebiotics in them. Part of the reason why I tell people to take probiotics with food is they get the prebiotics, and as our ancestors, how we got probiotics is with the food we eat. So I always try to copy nature, take them with food. Yes?
Why
20 billion once a day?
Yeah, once a day. And again, with people with real gut issues or have just had antibiotics, I'll do a lot more sometimes.
Is it bad to take more?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily, yeah. Not typically. Yes.
Going back to, what she was saying over there with like constipation and things like that.
Yeah.
And how it affects, the colon and all that.
Yeah.
Can, if you are constipated, can it affect your bladder?
Yeah, hugely. Yeah. Probably, I mean, anatomically, the bladder is right next to the colon. So
If you're squishing it or?
well, it'd be squishing it, but it'd also be passing inflammatory byproducts across those membranes. So it's really important to address with the bladder issue, for sure. Yeah, in the back.
Important to address what? Did you?
With a bladder issue, if there's an ongoing bladder issue, yeah, that's chronic. In the back.
Would you say nausea would be considered an early or a late indication of a bad gut?
Well, nausea is probably equally related to gut as it is nerves. So stress response, classic feature is nausea. Also a classic feature of significant pain is nausea. So you have to discern the source. So I would say that I wouldn't really speculate that nausea has anything to do with the gradation of a gut issue. It could be entirely unrelated. But typically people with gut issues where nausea is a feature, that's usually a sign that something's significantly going on. So, you know, I want to just touch on a couple of other like gut helping protocols. You know, we just had a mention of constipation, and obviously if the bowels are stuck, you know, you're recirculating toxins, and we really want to address that. So we can look at the foundations, hydration, exercise, fiber, but we may need to actually use herbs or other compounds that will help get the bowel flowing more regularly. So that can come into play in terms of a conversation. We also are going to want to look at, hey, do we think that there is a issue with enzymatic processes, right? We talked about how the stomach makes acid, how the pancreas makes digestive enzymes, how the liver, gallbladder makes bile. Well, what if those organs aren't doing that? Then you're not breaking down your foods and you're causing fermentation and rotting and inflammation in the gut. So sometimes we need to use some of those tools to directly enhance the assimilation process so that we can improve and restore gut function, probably while we're working on the underlying causes of why those organs are shut down, which may be stress related. They may just be related because the gut's so out of balance that it's shut down some of those organs as a consequence too. We may want to do agents that definitively soothe and repair the gut lining. I like glutamine for that. I like slipperyelm for that. Those are, you know, that's an herb, slipperyelm. Glutamine is an amino acid. So those come into protocols fairly frequently. There's a lot of other compounds out there, but you know, those are a couple I'll just mention. So, of course, when I'm working with someone, it's not exclusively diet, usually, if it's significant gut issues, but that's the centerpiece of things oftentimes. And there's a lot of other agents that usually in a stepwise fashion we can introduce depending on the context. Back?
Would you mind writing those two herbs?
Oh yeah, glutamine is an amino acid, L-glutamine. And then slipperyelm. I also like aloe, DGL, which is deglycerized licorice, in the same category as slipperyelm. So there's quite a few agents that are really good in that area. Yeah, Beck.
Do you have an opinion about Essiac tea?
What's
Essiac tea?
Oh, Essiac? I do like Essiac. I don't really use it directly for gut issues a lot. I use it for some neurological issues and cancer. Really good tool for several areas, but don't typically use it in the gut a lot.
Does it do any harm?
No, I wouldn't say so.
All right.
Yes.
when you named slippery elm, did you say breathing?
What's that?
Breathing, did you say breathing was?
Breathing.
Breathing, slippery elm and breathing?
No, breathing, like practice your breath.
Oh, yeah, but,
Did you say that in there?
well, I said that earlier as related to how stress influences gut health, right? So that was how I related that.
Okay, I thought it was close to slippery elm, and I just wasn't sure if you said
Okay.
breath or not. so
Yeah, I definitely said it
I
earlier.
was curious.
Okay, got it.
Okay, another curiosity, what is slippery elm?
It's an
taste
herb.
like? No, I don't.
It's a pretty neutral taste. It tastes like, I don't know.
Okay.
It's hard to describe
Just
it.
as long as it isn't as bad as castor oil.
Yeah, it wouldn't taste like that.
It's very pleasant.
Yes, yeah. In the back, yes.
Is there something you typically prescribe for someone who's had a gallbladder?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I probably will tell people that at least people who don't have a gallbladder, in an ideal world for the rest of their life, they should be taking some bile replacement agent for assimilating their fats. I really like a compound called beta-TCP. It's the one I use. But with every major meal, I ask them to preemptively take one tablet of that compound. It has beet extract, it has some of the bile salts in it, a couple of other compounds that really help facilitate the fat absorption, which is very important.
What about digestive bitters?
Yeah, I love digestive bitters. I use them every day. I like them especially because it's one of those compounds that will actually teach the body how to make its own stomach acid, versus if you take hydrochloric acid, it doesn't do quite as well teaching the stomach to make its own acids. So you put them directly on the tongue, and reflexively the neurological system will make more stomach acid.
Are there some that are better than others, or like?
Yeah, I use the herbs gentian, skullcap, and ginger are my favorites to use.
Is that Gentin?
Yeah, gentian. Gentian is the most bitter herb in our Western herbal knowledge. It's very, very bitter.
It was gentian, skullcap,
And ginger. Yeah. Depending on how warm or cool someone is, I'll switch between those other two. Yeah. Okay. Any kind of tailing questions about this topic? All right. So we are a little after 8. I am going to stick around, answer these questions. I will also, when I finish answering those questions, hang out if anyone wants to chat with me and ask me a question, or just come out and introduce themselves. So if you need to take off, which I totally get and appreciate, thanks for coming in. And I look forward to seeing you in a future open forum. And yeah, thanks for coming. Okay.
Here.
Yeah. So the intermittent fasting question, someone had a what that question? Yeah. Okay, Dawson wants to know. Yeah, that's right. So intermittent fasting, this concept is that you go through periods within a 24-hour period withholding from food, fasting. Metabolically, what that can achieve, we talked about some of the benefits to the gut, but metabolically, I really like how it regulates insulin and glucagon, which are the main metabolic signals of breaking things down to use as energy or building things up to store as energy. Insulin stores energy, glucagon breaks things down. So particularly if people are having weight issues or if they're having blood sugar issues, and insulin's a big part of blood sugar issues, I really like the concept of intermittent fasting. Helps people very successful with weight loss, really helps regulate blood sugar. And there's a lot of iterations for that. You could say 12 hours is an intermittent fast, or you could say 20 hours is. I mean, it's whatever eating window you want to have in a day. A traditional one I'll use is go 16 to 18 hours from the last meal of one day to the first meal of the next day. Whether that's eating lunch and dinner, something like that. And so, I think for that to metabolically be the most useful, about 5 days a week seems to really be where that clicks into gear. You could do that though, once or twice a week, certainly if you just want to give your gut a little break and kind of shake up your metabolism a little bit. So there's infinite iterations of how you can do it. You can also fast for a 24-hour period, or, you know, when you get into that, you start stretching your metabolism a little bit, and you start to kind of kick into like protein breakdown mode. So I don't generally recommend like, you know, 24-hour fasts regularly, just because I think it's a little hard on metabolism. But, you know, does that kind of help a little bit, or?
Yeah, I just wanted to know the efficacy of the 2-day period or twice a week, and so sustained detoxes, because I like to do twice a week.
Yeah.
So it's gradual.
Yeah, it's a gradual thing. I mean, I think any degree of intermittent fasting is a useful tool. So I think, again, evolutionarily, we're designed to benefit greatly from periods of breaks from eating. Yeah. Mast cell activation disorder. Mast cells are part of the immune system that is associated with the Th2 response. That's the kind of allergy response. So one of the things we could argue is with mast cell activation disorder, we may want to go look at the gut and figure out why is the immune system dysregulated and what does that have to do with dysbiosis, leaky gut, and pushing that, because remember 80% of the immune system's in the gut. But essentially what mast cell disorder is it's a specific type of immunoglobulin cell it's basically part of that Th2 response system. Histamines kind of in mast cells are very similar. So it depends on what the manifestation is for someone. Some people will have like skin issues, others will have, you know, different organs affected by it.
Anaphylactic to an increasing number of foods.
Yep, those are true allergies developing, and those allergies are very much, food allergies are a complete consequence of a heavily dysregulated immune system, and almost always that starts in the gut. So the nice thing about allergies is they can be cured, which means you can reverse allergies, but they're very serious until you get the gut healed. You don't want to like say, oh, I'll just, you know, yeah, they can have, they're very fast reactions.
So they're